Diana Paik, and I am the Executive Director of the Newton Institute. And I'm thrilled to be with you today as the third in our series of Facebook Live events. Today is a very exciting day for us as we are in the process of birthing our new website. And our new website has been in the works for probably 3 or 4 years, and we are finally at the point that during this week our new website will come forth and be available to you. It is being launched with the same web address that we have always had, which is www.newtoninstitute.org. And over the next several days, you may see it emerge and see the shift from our current website to the new website. So stay tuned. Birthing doesn't always happen in the moment that we expect it to. And so today we had hoped that our new website would be up and available. And as it turns out, it's not ready to be born yet. So we just have to wait for it to come forth and for it to be available for us. So today we are here to talk about why we are here and how we got here, and issues around birth and incarnation and life challenges and all of the things that are associated with coming from being a soul into being in a body and the connections among souls. And as we are connected, we're currently connected here as a group on this particular site. And over the next several days, we are going to be announcing a movement of this particular group into a new format. So there are about 9,000 members of this particular group, and we have designed a new Facebook page, and we have designed a new Facebook group. And Sanella is going to be posting the information for both the Facebook group and the fan page so that you can join. Our next live event will be hosted from that new site. So we are going to be posting that information so that you can begin to make that transition and move on to the new site. It gives us a way to handle information better and to share with you more about who we are and what we're doing. Okay, so just to get started, starting at the beginning. And when we think about the beginning, we're thinking about how did the soul start? And how did it become a soul? As from being a part of the one. You know, we started all as part of the whole that is consciousness, whatever we call that, the one, God. And the soul is a part of that. We each are an individual part of that has differentiated and has a unique identity. So it's like each drop of water in the ocean still has the entire essence of the ocean, but also has its unique identity as that particular drop of water or that particular snowflake. It is still part of everything, and yet it has its own unique characteristics. And the soul at the time it is born becomes differentiated and has its uniqueness. And it's supported in its initial journey, as Michael describes in Journey of Souls, in developing into its uniqueness and learning how to be itself and learning how to grow and learn. And over the process of development, a soul connects with a guide who is with you from the time that you start. And you connect with other souls. So our initial soul group is souls who are the same age as us, who start about the same time as we do. And our soul groups may change over time. even though time is not a characteristic that that the soul identifies. But we may end up with different groups because our groups may change as we change and as we grow. And so our souls develop with the support of a guide. And if we think about our guides, what are our guides? Our guides may be of different types. So our initial guide is the one who is there with us at the time we're born. And there are guides who Michael described as birthing guides, who are there in the nursery to help with baby souls. And then there are those who are assigned to us individually who help us through our process. I have come across recently a number of people who are in the process of learning to be guides and learning how to guide without telling the soul what to do, which can be a very difficult process in human incarnation. And the guide is here to support us in the learning that we're choosing to do. They're not here to tell us what lessons to learn, but they're here to support us in learning the lessons that we're choosing. And so in a given lifetime, we may also have guides who are here to support us with individual lessons, with individual challenges. They may support us over a number of lifetimes on the same lesson. We may have guides who are here simply to support us in a challenge or a particular event. I know in my life I had someone come into this life who was here to help me balance my emotional side with my analytical side. And once that happened, that person was no longer in my life. That job was done and she left. And so it's interesting how guides can be with us for varying periods of time. We all know that we have a council of wise ones, whatever we call that group. And that group may be of varying numbers. I find that in general they're somewhere between 3 and 5 members of the council, but sometimes people have as many as 7, 8, 9, 10, 12. And they can be identified at times as specific guides for specific actions, specific tasks, specific lessons. So they may follow us a lifetime, several lifetimes, as we work on a particular lesson. I had one man early in my learning who had 3 guides who were there with him in addition to his counsel. And the first guide is one who had been his guru in many lives. And in this particular life, his guide was there supporting him in learning lessons and being a pain in his side. He was there to keep him present, to keep him mindful. And he had another guide who was there to always be ultimately supporting, who was there to give him good advice and to support him. And then the third guide was simply to remind him that he was loved. And it really varies how people identify their guides and how they work with them. It depends on the age of the soul, whether they are able to identify their guides in this lifetime, or when they go between lives, they go, oh, that's who that person is. They've always been there doing this. Or they find that someone comes into their life and leaves, and that may be a guide. That guide is there to support them. And we all know about the Council of Wise Ones, whatever you call that group. The council is here as they are extremely advanced souls, way more advanced than our other guides, who are here to support us in the advancement of our souls, and to support us in choosing not only the lessons that we are moving into either a between life state or into an incarnation to learn, but they're also there to support us in having the resources available to us. So when we choose a life and we choose lessons that we're going to learn, and people tend to be very the human characteristic of being impatient. Okay, I want to get this one done. I want to get these things done. And so if I want to get them done, how do I get them done? And my counsel, for example, told me, you're going to get a lot of stuff done in this lifetime. You have to take the resources to do it. You may not know what the resources are. That's part of the lesson, is to find out. But our counsel is there to support us so that we are able to accomplish the task that we set out for ourselves. So it's part of the getting ready to be born and moving into the process of incarnating is choosing a life to go into. And when we talk to clients, one of the things I find out usually is whether they have a choice of one life or more than one life. Is there more than one life you could have chosen to come into? Or is this the only one? And sometimes people say, yes, it's the only one. And other times say, no, there were a couple, but this is the one that I chose because it matched me the best, or it matched my choices the best. So then the question is, what are the lessons you're planning on learning, and how are they to manifest in a given life? We know that we have the capacity to manifest in our own lives. So how does that play out? Some of it plays out at a soul level. So we may set in place plans or activities or lessons that we're planning on learning. And sometimes the detail of that isn't something that we actually describe. So we may have a preliminary vision of what that might be, but not necessarily to a detailed level of knowing how it's going to happen and what's going to happen. So when we think about pre-birth plans, what are they and how do we get them? I recently had a client who in his past life he's obviously a very advanced soul. And in his past life, he was a monk. And he was a monk in a monastery in Tibet or Nepal or India. And most of his life he spent in meditation, and a good portion of that he spent out of body. And so as he was preparing in his later years to move out of his current body, he and his guides developed a plan for his next lifetime. So he mapped out what the lessons would be, what came next, how that would manifest. And so the soul itself was actually choosing what was going to happen while he was in that incarnation. And at the time of his death, he simply left the body for the last time, because he'd been in and out of the body, and he, in meditation, simply went into a trance state and left the body. And as he came into this lifetime, several hundred years later, he came in as someone who had absolutely no understanding and no connection with spirit. I mean, really no connection, total amnesia. And you would never guess from looking at this person that he had been a monk in his previous life, simply because he was a person of the world and had a corporate job and was very engaged in his work life and wasn't particularly interested in what was spiritual around him. And one of the people who came into his life with him, who followed him in, was his daughter, who is an even more advanced soul. And she's the one who prodded him to read Journey of Souls, which caused him ultimately to reach out and go on his own journey and find out about the monk and find out about this lifetime and the plans he'd made for this lifetime. And so when he talked to his counsel, he found out that this lifetime was about accumulating experiences that he hadn't had in other lifetimes. And so it explained why his life in this lifetime seemed very disjointed, because it was about accumulating a variety of different kinds of activities and different kinds of tasks and different kinds of experiences. And so he was very involved in setting up his pre-birth plans. Do our pre-birth plans change? Well, it depends on the plan, and it depends on what it is we're planning on doing. Since we all have free will, and we all have a capacity to move at our own speed, we may set up in a lifetime that we are going to complete a lesson. And if we're completing that lesson, great. But what if we don't? What if we make some progress? Or what if we don't make any progress? How does that change what we do? How does that change what it is that our plans become? And so our own choices within a lifetime then can shift what those plans look like. So if I say that I'm going to conquer my lack of self-love in a lifetime, that may be overly ambitious, or my desire to learn patience. I'm not doing that in one lifetime. I'm way too impatient, and so there's a lot more of that lesson that needs to happen. And so because I'm impatient, I push myself into things, and then I find that I have new things to deal with. I have new things to explore. And so my pre-birth plan may have been to address this lesson, and I'm in fact following that plan to address the lesson, but I may not have laid in the specifics down to the gnat's eyelash of how I was going to do that and what would happen if I went in direction A or direction B. And so some things that we encounter are much more malleable. They change, they shift. It doesn't mean that we're not following the plan, but it means we're addressing the plan in the way that we are in a lifetime. And so one aspect of our planning is planning with other souls. So we may plan with another soul to come in and to do certain things. And that may come to fruition just as we planned. So my friend who came in with me and was my friend all the way through college, at the point I went through my hypnotherapy training, we got to the point of the lesson, and she helped me learn how to incorporate analytical and emotional in one activity. And so she was there for that. So that plan was fulfilled. But what happens when we have plans with souls that in a loving planning that are not particularly loving or not particularly fulfilling? For example, what happens when your partner dies, and your partner dies young? And I recently had a client whose 28-year-old brother, died, and she had been blaming herself because she should have called him and he accidentally overdosed, and she felt that she had let him down. And when she went between lives and talked to him, she learned that it was his plan all along to come in and support her and her brother, and to leave because they needed to learn the remainder of the lesson on their own. And so that actually was the plan. But from a human perspective, that doesn't really make a lot of sense. From a soul perspective, it does. And a lot of our confusion about pre-birth plans are that we tend to see them in this lifetime where we experience pain and say, why did this person have to leave? If he could manifest healing, why didn't he heal? Why did he leave when he did? And what was that plan about? And sometimes our soulmates that we have in a lifetime don't come in with us. So I find clients who come in and they say, I'm wondering if my soulmate is here in this lifetime. Am I going to have a soulmate in this lifetime? And the answer may be no, because some of the lessons that we're here to learn, we need to do on our own. And so our people who are souls who are very loving may come and go in our lives in a way to support us in the learning we need to have. I recently had a woman whose 18-year-old son accidentally overdosed, and she found him dead in his room one morning. And she had done a lot of work by the time she came to me and realized that that was his path, that was his journey, and that his journey was to come and get people started on a path of connection. And so when she came to see me, she was asking about, well, why did I have to have the death of my son in this lifetime? Why did this have to happen? What was this about? And what she found was that in her own life, she'd had a very dysfunctional upbringing, and that when she had her son, she had created a loving family for him, and that he grew up in a loving family, and that that family supported him and stayed together even more strongly as a result of his death. And he had drawn others into the family, so an organic family had grown. And so the lesson really was about family and how she was learning the lesson of the value of family, and her son left because that was something that she had to continue on her own and support others who were his friends, who then joined her family. And so we don't always understand it from a human perspective, but the plan may not have actually shifted. And that's why when people go between lives and they ask the question, why did this have to happen? What is this about? What is the lesson about? They may find that the lesson is exactly as it was meant to be, and that the detail of it is something that caused us sadness or grief or anger, and yet that's part of the learning that we were meant to have. And so, in fact, the lesson is continuing as it was meant to continue. So the question about manifesting as the creators of our own lives can be looked at from the perspective of the human and how we manifest, and what we can do and be in our human form to manifest, as well as looking at it from the soul perspective of how do I manifest for my highest good. And we tend easily, because we're human, to look at ourselves through our human eyes. And yet if you shift the perspective, the answers are going to look different when you look at it through soul eyes. So a question that I had was, what do we come into life with? When we come into an incarnation and we've made a choice to come into a body, how do we do it? What do we know? And what do we come in with? So we've been talking about the soul's journey, and the soul has moved through lifetimes, probably thousands of lifetimes, and has learning in each lifetime. So there is the lineage of the soul and all that the soul comes in with. There is also a genetic lineage. So you have the genes that are come together through your mother and your father that are in your DNA that come together. And so you have a genetic lineage that makes you who you are genetically. You also have environmental lineages. So if you think about what your grandparents or your parents experienced and how that impacts you, there's a lot of research being done on prenatal trauma and what happens to us before we're born. And if you think about it, when you are born, the egg that formed you was in your mother, and that egg was inside of her at the time she was inside of her mother. So the egg that formed you was inside your grandmother, because your mother was an egg inside of her, and once your grandmother became pregnant with your mother, then that egg was inside of your mother, inside of your grandmother. And so if your grandmother experienced some kind of trauma or experience that impacted potentially the genetic formation of the egg and of your mother, and so the trauma lineages can be traced back through many generations, and the impact of trauma on the unborn child are being studied now, and finding that if a child experiences trauma in the womb, that they may come in with the impact of trauma with no memory of it. And so that's a lineage that is another lineage. And there is also something called epigenetics. And what epigenetics is, it's the study of how behavior changes the way your genes work. And so if behavior surrounding you at the time you're born impacts you, then your genes are going to work in certain ways, and your body is going to develop in certain ways, and behaviors will develop in certain ways. And so we come in with these varying lineages that help form us into who we are. So I am the product of my mother, of my grandmother, of my great-grandmother, of my grandparents. I'm the product of all of their learning, of the trauma that they experienced, of my mother's trauma, of everything that came before me, in addition to what my soul comes in with. So it's quite a mix, and each one of us has those unique mixes as we come in. So we also come in with carryovers from previous lives. And this I've found as really fascinating. So when we come into a life, we come in with amnesia, usually about the previous life. And the older we get, the more amnesia we get. And that tends to be that we come in with some emotional memory at the time we're a baby. And we come in with some understanding of what happened or what we're carrying forward. And you hear about children who have memories of their previous life. And there are stories of, children who at 3 and 4 years old are talking about the instrumentation on an instrument panel in an airplane that is crashing into the ocean and they died in. Well, how does a 3-year-old know how to describe instrumentation on an airplane? They don't, except by remembering. I have encountered a number of people who come in with dreams and who have dreams that they want to understand. And when they go into a past life and begin to explore, the dream then may emerge as something that they experienced in a previous life. Many of these experiences seem to fade as the person gets older. So I had a man who came in with the memory of a dream that he had up until the time he was 8 or 9 of being killed in a pool hall, and that he knows that he was killed. And so he wanted to figure out what happened. And so we took him back into that lifetime. And he found himself standing, talking to an older man who was very upset with him, who was standing there with a pool cue in his hand, and who was really angry with him and was telling him what a horrible person he was, and just really, talking to him about what was happening. And so it's interesting, as he was engaging with this man, he was talking to him about something that had happened, and he realized that this man listened to him, and that the man was actually his father-in-law. And so his father-in-law was upset with him because he had cheated on his daughter. And so the guy said his piece and left, and goes, oh, good, this guy's left. And so he went back to the pool table and was talking to his friends, and out of the corner of his eye, he sees this guy coming, running at him, and then it went blank. And so his soul is now watching, and it turns out it was his brother-in-law, who was also angry about his sister being cheated on, who came after him with a knife and slit his throat accidentally. And so there he is standing, the brother-in-law is standing there in horror, and the guy, when he comes back into his body, says, I came into this life needing to be loyal. It was absolutely imperative that I was loyal. So there was a question that someone just asked about, does the family genetic lineage dissolve after a life is over, given that we don't always reincarnate with the family, or does it continue to stay attached to the soul even after the passing of that life? I haven't found that the genetic lineage stays, because, as is mentioned here, we tend not to reincarnate into the same genetic lineage. So it sets us up in a given lifetime. And so the next part of that also is the family trauma lineage something that a soul can consider in the pre-birth plan and make part of the body decision? I think so. So when we have that lineage, if it's part of a lesson that we're learning, so if we're learning about body trauma or experience with, schizophrenia or something, we can then incorporate that because it may be a lesson that is still unlearned, that we're still working on. And so we may choose another family or another genetic line, because we tend not to go into the same genetic lineage. And the soul can consider that it does start to look at, what did I learn? What didn't I learn? What am I still working on? And so that can be a holdover as well, that you have lessons that are unfinished. Something that I've been asking people recently when we are looking at life choice is, when they explain that they're working on a lesson, is this the life where you're going to complete this lesson or not? Or is this the life where you're going to address this lesson? You know it's a lesson. Is it the one where you're going to finish it, where you're going to make good progress, where you're just going to fool around with it or ignore it? And usually the soul knows. So sometimes we come into a life where we've been working on something for a long time. Usually the bigger lessons like patience, self-love, connection, soul connection to others, emotional bonding, these kinds of things, and the things that trauma brings out, tend to travel over lifetimes. And I'm working with someone right now who had prenatal trauma, and at the time that she was born, her mother was very sick and her father was unavailable emotionally, and so she did not individuate into herself properly. And so she's bringing in trauma, and she's bringing in a lack of connection to the self. She doesn't, at the time she was born, she did not get a real clear understanding of who she is. And so the work that she's doing in this lifetime is to first identify the self and then love that self from a self perspective. And that's part of the work that she's doing in this lifetime. And when we took her back into the womb, she was aware as a soul that this was the lifetime that she was planning on not only discovering this gap in her soul's understanding, but also addressing it. She isn't sure how far she's going to get, but she is intent, the soul is intent on truly addressing and making progress on it. So it is something that we can find that lineage, it does impact the choices that we make and why we do what we do. So sometimes we come into a life and we come in with some memory or some feeling about something that's important to do. And it can be related to a previous life. I had a client a couple of years ago who came to me, and she was someone who was way overburdened with stuff. I mean, just totally overburdened. And so I asked her what was going on. She said, well, I am absolutely driven to developing and supporting the development of home care facilities for the elderly and giving them daycare options. It's absolutely critical I do that, and I'm just driven about it. I don't know why that's so important to me, but I'm driven about it. And then I also have my real estate business, and I love doing that. And I got married a few years ago, and my relationship is really important to me. And we just bought a house, and we're redoing the kitchen. So that's important to me, and I have 3 kids. And they are all very close to me, and I'm close to them. And so when we went back, we found some very interesting things. So in her previous life, she had been a young woman, and in that previous life, she had died in her 30s. So she didn't really complete her life's work, and she didn't ever marry, and she didn't ever have children. And so she had focused on the elderly. And so she came into this life with the exact same soul as a mother. And the two of them together were intent on completing the work that she had started in that life. So in that life, her name was Claudine. And so Claudine had wanted to do this work with the elderly, and Veronica, who's in this current life, kept doing it. And when she realized that it was Claudine's work and not hers, she realized that she could let it go with no consequences because it wasn't of this life, and she could simplify. And one of the things her guides told her and her counsel told her was, you need to simplify your life, and you need to move into this life and let go of tasks and work that related to this previous life. And they also gave her information saying it's really important that you pay attention to your children, and that your children are only here for a brief amount of time, and they're only with you for a brief amount of time, whether you grow away from them or, something happens to them or whatever. Pay attention to your children and to your husband. And I contacted her about a year ago, and she told me at that point that she was in a world of hurt because her oldest son had just been murdered. And she then she had lost the copy of the recording from our session, and so I sent it to her, and she said, I really want to have that because I want to hear what was said. And when I listened to it, I realized that her guides were telling her to pay attention to her children. And I thought that was so interesting that she was getting that, and she actually had done that. And so sometimes the tasks and the things that we do in lives can bleed over. In addition to the feelings, we don't necessarily have memory of what happened in that life, but we may have this emotional connection. And when we do this work, what we're working with is emotional memory. We're not working with the conscious ego memory. And the emotional memory is the soul memory that carries with us. And in the human brain, the emotional part of the brain develops early, and that's the part that the soul joins, and that happens in the womb. But the cognitive part, the prefrontal cortex, where we think about things and where we begin to develop conscious memory, doesn't develop until later, well after the child is born, and continues to develop up through 28 or 29 years old. And so that part of the brain isn't available when the child is born, so it doesn't interfere with the emotional memory that is stored. And so it's not, to me, that's why we have emotional connections early that may in fact fade over time as the ego, the individual ego in a lifetime comes forward. So we can learn lessons over time with other souls, and sometimes we come in with other souls. We have lifetimes with other souls, as I just explained with Veronica. She's really an interesting person because she had also came in with an understanding of having a very strong connection to her father. And as she went back into the womb, she realized at first that her father was someone that she had shared the womb with. And as it turns out, she realized that she and the soul that turned out to be her father was actually her twin. And in the womb, when her father was in the womb, she was a twin with that soul, and the baby that she was in wasn't viable. And so the baby she was in died. The father continued, but she had made a contract to come into life with him and be connected to him. And so she had to wait until he was old enough to have children so she could become his child. So she always had this special bond with him in a way that she couldn't explain. And once she got to a place that she could understand it and explain it, she could see that, yeah, it felt like she was connected on that level. And it was something that the conscious mind wouldn't have been able to understand. And yet, being in the womb with him for several months meant that they developed an emotional bond that was much stronger because twins develop these incredible bonds. And so that kind of leads me to something about how long is it between incarnations? You know, I was reading something on the Facebook group that someone said, well, they thought the average was a couple of years. And yet we find varying amounts. And so with Veronica, it was, you know, a lot of years. So it was 20-something years because she was waiting for her father to be old enough to have children. Most of the time I find that there is usually somewhere in the range of a generation, so 20, 30 years. And it can be as short as a year, especially I found with souls that die suddenly. So you may have that, especially we found after the Holocaust. I found with people who had gone through dying in the gas chambers, especially children, that they came back very quickly. So I had a woman who was a 6-year-old child who died in the gas chamber with her mother, and who came back. She died in 1941 and was born in 1942. And so she came back right away because her experience was about that death. It wasn't about the life. And so whatever life lessons that she had planned for the previous life got shortchanged, and so she came back. And a number of souls a number of souls have that. So a child who dies in an accident. So you think about children who died in that building collapse down in Florida. That was an accident. And so what did they learn out of that? You know, you have a 6-year-old who dies in that. What did they learn? And so that life may have been shortchanged accidentally. And so they come back because they start over again and come back in another body. And there had to be a lesson out of that. That lesson may have been for the grandparent. That lesson may have been for, you know, the parent who survived. Or it may have been that experience of bonding at the time of death. we don't know what it is. But looking from a soul perspective, it can be a completely different experience. So I think the most interesting recently was I had a woman who was born in 1959, and her previous life, in her previous life, she was a man, and she died in 1977. And so I thought, wow, that's really strange to have that happen. And so when we got to her counsel, I brought it up and I said, explain to me, because I'm obviously really dense here, how someone can be born in 1959 and the previous life end in 1977. And is that correct? And her guides then answered and said, yes, that is correct. And I said, how does that impact the soul? How does that impact the soul and the vitality in each lifetime? And they said, in each lifetime, she had absolutely what she needed in that lifetime. And so as I was thinking about that today, I was thinking about the growth pattern. And that growth pattern of the child who is growing up and the decline of the man who had died in the previous life. And so there was a decline in one and a growth in the other. And so to me, that was really interesting. And so I had never really experienced what had happened, an actual crossover. But we know that sometimes souls are split and live in two different bodies. And in this case, this was the first one that I had encountered where the soul actually overlapped lives. But most of the time you find that there is some amount of time, and there's a reason for that amount of time, and it varies from soul to soul. We just had a question about have clients ever talked about what their soul does between lives? Yes, and I actually have a number of clients who spend a lot of time between lives. And so I'm working with someone right now who I've worked with for probably the past year or so. And she has spent a lot of time between lives. And in this lifetime, it had been probably 1,000 years since she reincarnated. And because she hadn't reincarnated for a long time, I said, what are you doing? What are you spending that time, even though there is no time? What are you doing there? And she said, I'm in training to be a guide. And so I'm mirroring other guides. And so in her progress, she is on this earth in this lifetime in a very difficult life, living with others who she doesn't identify with, because they are like the souls she will be having to work with. And when she is in the spirit realm, or has recently been in the spirit realm, she has been working as a junior guide. I have had others who are teachers who go and they train others. I've had others, generally people don't just lie around and relax, although there are some that do. Some spend a fair amount of time recuperating from a previous life. So if someone dies in a traumatic situation, or if someone dies either through an accident or something that's very traumatic, or even suicide, there may be a time that is needed to cleanse, to have the soul begin to let go and learn the lessons of that lifetime. So if someone commits suicide, I know when I was going through my training to become an LBL facilitator, the life that I went into, I committed suicide. And I was absolutely devastated because my partner had had a stillborn baby, and I couldn't support her, and I couldn't support me, and I was really emotional. And as I'm walking off of a cliff, I said, I'm never going to be emotional again. I'm never going to live by emotions. And so this was the lifetime that I came in to resolve that. So in between lives, when I went into the spirit world, it was like I didn't really even think I could go there. They wouldn't let me in. And so basically I got dragged in and said, just get over yourself. And so I spent a fair amount of time resolving that wounding and cleaning it up and allowing my soul to learn from that experience. And I think there was just recently a question as the souls that commit suicide often reincarnate quickly to get another chance. I think it varies, and I think it's what the suicide is about. What is the lesson of that suicide? So I've also heard, and I've had people ask, do people who commit suicide, did they shortchange the life that they were supposed to have, and does their soul stay around until that life was supposed to be over? My sense is that there is a lesson that in the suicide itself and in ending that life and what needs to be learned. And I think some of that can be learned on the soul level, and some of that, depending upon what the lesson is, needs to happen in an incarnated form. And it varies depending on the lesson. So it may be that if someone commits suicide, that they may come back very quickly, because that is what the soul needs in order to learn. I don't think it's so much about getting another chance as it is about what is the learning that comes out of the suicide or comes out of the death. And my sense for me was that the suicide was showing me how out of balance I was, that I didn't understand the value of having a strong emotional self, and that I needed to reincarnate. I mean, that was probably 1,000 years ago, and so it took me 1,000 years of incarnating before I was actually ready to learn that lesson. And so I think there are a variety of reasons why, and the amount of time in between, and what we do when we're there. I did have a client who hadn't incarnated in a long time, and she felt very disconnected from a body. And sometimes when people feel very disconnected from their bodies in this lifetime, it's because they haven't been in a human body in a while, or they have lived on another planet in another life form, or they simply haven't incarnated. And this client, when we went into a past life, this was one of her first past lives with me, she goes into this body, and I said, "Tell me about you." And she says, "I'm a frog." And I'm going, "Okay, you're a frog." She goes, "Yeah, ribbit, ribbit." And so I go, "Okay, so let's go back to childhood." I'm just trying to not fall apart thinking about a frog. And I take her back to childhood with 1, 2, and 3, and she goes, "I'm a tadpole." And so here she is as a tadpole, and then she moves into having legs, and she comes up onto the ground, and she then finishes that life as a frog. And as she finishes that life, she sees herself in something like a silver bullet shooting up into the light, and then that bullet is opening like a chrysalis, and she is flying, and her soul is merging into the plane of connection of consciousness and complete connection. And she goes, "Oh, I'm home." And so I said, and when we got to talk to her counsel, I said, "Okay, tell us about the frog adventure. What was that about?" And she said that they wanted to show me the life cycle so that I would understand the process of living and dying, but not have it happen over an extended point, because that wasn't the point. It was just simply to refamiliarize me with being in a body because it's been so long since I've been in any body, and that it has cycles. And I think that's interesting, that our guides support us in our learning, whatever that learning is, and help us to move in the ways that we're choosing to move and needing to move for our life journey. And so I don't think there is a standard, of time in between. And each of us, depending upon the lessons that we're learning and our soul is learning, and how advanced our souls are, we create the opportunities with our guides to progress. And so that progression varies with each one of us. We find ourselves individually here, and we find ourselves isolated. And then when we have the opportunity to go back between lives, we feel the greater connection. And I think that's what this work is all about, is to remember that our only connection is not in this human body that is isolated, but that we have this other plane that we can work from, that we can be in connection with consciousness always, if we choose to be, and part of us always is. And that we have these varying parts of us that work in different ways, on different levels, on different wavelengths, with different energies. And that as a human, those are what we work with. If you've come from another planet, you may have different lineages because you have lived on another planet. And I find that I've been working recently with souls who come from planets that are much more connected to each other than ours. And those connections can be on a heart level. So I've had 2 clients recently who have come from the same type of planet, where they are energetically connected to the planet, and that the planet is supportive of them, and that I'm a Reiki master, and so we use Reiki energy, use healing energy, and they naturally interact with the planet and with each other with that energy. And when they come around people who don't have that energy, they feel very disconnected from them. And in this human form, there are people who have that, and there are those who don't, because they don't come from that environment. And so those who are coming in from other planetary bodies, from other realms, from other planes, may not have the same experience as those of us who have incarnated for millennia on this planet, even if we came from something before. Generally, when I find someone who feels disconnected from the body, when I take them back into the womb, I ask, is this your first incarnation in human form? And I find out the answer. And so I recently had a young man, he's 21 years old, who is very disconnected from his human form. And I asked, is this your first incarnation as a human? And he said no. His soul said no. No, I've been here before, but part of this journey is learning how to connect with this body and be in this body and connect with the vibrations that one feels through this body. And that's part of what I'm here to learn. And I thought that's really interesting. I mean, this is a 21-year-old who is on this journey of discovery in a human body, trying to figure out what being human is all about. And so there's such difference among us, and yet we are all connected on this soul plane. And I think that's we all come in with other things, and we all have lessons that we're learning, and we all have guides and supports. It's how do we connect and how do we learn to connect. And doing this work, either as a facilitator or receiving a session or going through a session, gives you the ability to reconnect on an emotional level with that sense, with your sense of self, the sense of whole. I know when I went through my training and went back out of the womb towards a past life, and my soul was able to expand out of a body, and it was the elation that I felt in that moment of feeling the wholeness of my soul was pretty overwhelming. And it's something that, as I'm thinking about it now, I really can feel that. And these things you don't forget, and you remember. We always tell our clients, you will remember, and all of these suggestions that you receive, you will remember what happened, and you will be able to work with it and connect. And I find that to be really true, that we shift our ability to function in this lifetime as a result of this work. And so it looks like I am running out of time, because time is a human thing. And before we leave, I want to remind you that Sanella has posted information about our new Facebook group. There is a new Michael Newton fan page, and she has posted the link to it, and a new Facebook group. We're moving over into that group because it gives us more latitude, and we are going to be having our next talk through that group. And Rita Borenstein is going to be doing the next presentation in November, and so it will be on that platform. So if you're interested in seeing Rita's presentation, please check out the link and be sure that you sign up before Rita's presentation in November. Also, for those of you who weren't here at the beginning, we are in the process of giving birth to our upgraded website, and Sanella's just posted the group information again. And our website is going to have the exact same web address as our current one, newtoninstitute.org, and it has been in process. It has been in utero for several years, and it is past due, and we are trying to give birth to it right now, and we were hoping it would be up as of today, and it looks like it should be up by the end of the week. But so you may see our website going up and down as they try to bring up the new one. So just be aware that lots of things are happening, and there are a lot of us who are doing this work, and there are a lot of us available to be available to you if you have questions, both on this group and on our new group. And so I thank you all for being here today and being part of this, and I wish you well, and have enjoyed being with you here today and connected in spirit always. So thank you so much.